The signal arrived the old way. No flare of light across the sky, no dramatic interruption of every screen on the planet. It was simply a reading, quiet and cold, caught by a deep space relay station orbiting far past the edge of the solar system. The technician on duty that morning was a young woman named Talia Reyes. She had been eating a sandwich when the alert chimed. She set the sandwich down. She never picked it up again. The signal was a transmission, and it came from a fleet sitting motionless just beyond the orbit of Neptune. Not one ship, not two. The scan counted 52 vessels, most of them larger than any warship Earth had ever built, a few of them larger than small moons. They hung in a tight, patient formation, still as something that already knew its prey had nowhere left to run. The message itself was short. It had been rendered into every major human language, a detail that unsettled people more than almost anything else about it. Someone had studied Earth long enough to learn how its people spoke to one another. The message read, "The threshold ascendancy requires the immediate and total submission of the world-designated Earth Prime. You possess no military force capable of resistance. You possess no allies among the powers of this region. You are given 96 hours to send a delegation prepared to negotiate the terms of your integration. Failure to comply will result in orbital bombardment of 3 population centers as a demonstration of resolve. We are patient. We are reasonable. We suggest you be the same." The world did not panic immediately. There was a strange hush first, the particular quiet that settles over people when they've heard something too large for their minds to have caught up to yet. Governments convened emergency sessions within the hour. The United Nations Security Council met inside 3. Generals were pulled from sleep. Scientists were summoned to verify the sensor data. No one doubted it for long. The fleet was real. The signal was real. And the technological footprint of those 52 ships, cross-referenced against every sensor array Earth possessed, was advanced enough that even the most optimistic military planners went quiet. Commander Elias Ockhaffer was one of those planners. He sat in a bunker beneath a mountain range in the Rockies, surrounded by screens, and looked at the incoming data for a long time without speaking. He had spent 2 decades of his career theorizing about what a first contact crisis might look like. He had written papers on it. He had run war games built around it. None of his scenarios had looked like this. "They chose Neptune's orbit deliberately," he said finally. "Close enough to reach us within hours if they decide to move. Far enough that we can't do anything reckless and hand them an excuse." Beside him, a tall, composed diplomat named Miriam Solano nodded slowly. She was the one who would be sent to negotiate if that was the path chosen, and she had spent the last hour absorbing everything Earth's intelligence agencies actually knew about the threshold ascendancy, which amounted to almost nothing. A name, a fleet, little else. 96 hours, she said. That isn't the timeline of something that wants to annihilate us. No, Ockhaffer agreed. It's the timeline of something that wants to own us. There's a difference. I'm just not sure the difference matters much to the 3 cities they've promised to burn if we don't cooperate. Around the room, the rest of the emergency planning staff worked through their own smaller crises. Logistics officers mapping evacuation routes for the 3 largest coastal cities on the assumption the ultimatum was genuine. Analysts cross-checking the translated message for any grammatical tell that might suggest machine translation rather than fluent comprehension, and finding none, which unsettled several of them more than a mistranslation would have. A junior analyst named Preeti Chandrasekaran kept returning to a single detail that no one else seemed to be dwelling on. The message had used the phrase population centers rather than cities. It was a small thing. It read to her like the vocabulary of someone who thought about targets the way an actuary thought about risk. not the way a conqueror thought about conquest. She raised it once, was told it was noted, and was not asked about it again. She wrote it down anyway, in the private notebook she kept for exactly this kind of observation, the kind that never made it into an official briefing, but sometimes turned out to matter more than anything that did. What happened next was the part that most histories of that period got wrong, Ockhafer would say years later, in the one interview he ever gave about those first hours. He meant that the popular story, governments arguing over whether to resist or negotiate, was true as far as it went, but it left out the third option nobody outside a very small circle had known existed at all. What happened over the following hours would later be described in most histories as a single unified debate, governments arguing over whether to resist or negotiate. That much was true as far as it went. There were voices insisting resistance was suicide, and the censor data mostly agreed with them. There were voices insisting negotiation was survival, and they weren't entirely wrong either. But there was a third voice, quieter than the rest, coming from a place most of the planet had never heard of, run by people whose names appeared in no public record. That place was called the Bastion. It sat inside a mountain in the Yukon, buried under nearly 2 kilometers of rock and reinforced alloy. It had been under construction for 21 years, ever since a much smaller, much quieter first contact event that Earth's governments had managed to keep almost entirely secret. A lone survey vessel, badly damaged, crewed by a single alien who had died before anyone could exchange a single word with it. What that vessel left behind, its onboard systems, its hull composition, the strange architecture of its drive core, had quietly rewritten everything humanity understood about the physics of travel between stars. In 21 years, the Bastion had produced exactly one thing. It had consumed more capital than any peacetime program in human history. It had employed over 7,000 scientists, engineers, and support staff, each of whom had signed agreements that would have seemed unenforceable on paper and were, in practice, enforced with total seriousness. The project had a name. The name was simple. The name was Warden. The people who ran the Bastion called General Adrian Kessler the morning the Ascendancy's ultimatum arrived. Kessler was 63, built like something poured rather than born, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that went very still whenever he was thinking hard. He had commanded the Bastion for the past 11 years. He listened to the report. He studied the fleet data. He asked exactly 2 questions. How long until we're ready? The answer was 4 hours for final systems verification. 6 to bring the drive to full readiness. And the crew? The answer was that they had been aboard and standing by since the previous week, from the moment the deep space relays first detected the fleet's approach. A call Kessler had made on his own authority, technically requiring a committee vote he could not afford to wait for. Good, Kessler said. He picked up a different line. Get me the Secretary General. The conversation lasted just under 40 minutes. Most of it has never been released publicly. What is known is that by its end, the Secretary General had authorized a course of action no elected body had formally approved, bypassing every ordinary channel of international consent, a decision she would later describe in private as the only one she could have lived with. She was not talking about politics when she said that. She was talking about something else entirely. What the public record does show is the sequence of calls Kessler made in the hour that followed to the 6 other governments that had, over the previous 2 decades, quietly contributed funding, materials, or personnel to the Bastion under agreements so heavily compartmentalized that no single official outside Kessler's own office had ever seen the complete list of contributors. Each of those calls followed roughly the same shape. A short, unembellished briefing, a single question about readiness, and an answer that Kessler recorded in a private log rather than any official channel, on the theory that a record which did not officially exist could not be officially seized, leaked, or subpoenaed before the ship had a chance to matter. He would later say it was the least elegant piece of statecraft he'd ever been party to, and also the only one he was fully certain had worked exactly as intended. Meanwhile, the world watched the fleet. Telescopes, professional and amateur alike, tracked the 52 ships holding position beyond Neptune. Every feed filled with images, theories, fear, dark humor, prayer. Religious leaders issued statements. Scientists issued statements. Soldiers, active and retired, studied the numbers and said very little in public and a great deal in private. Schools sent children home early across most of the planet. Some airspace closed, some didn't. Financial markets did things that analysts would spend years trying to fully explain. Miriam Solana was told at hour 18 that she might not be traveling to negotiate after all. No one told her why. She was told only to remain available. She sat in her hotel room in Geneva, watching the fleet telemetry scroll past on a secure screen, turning one line of the ultimatum over and over in her mind. We are patient. We are reasonable. She had spent a career dealing with people who like to call themselves reasonable. Patience was the more interesting word. Patience implied certainty, and certainty implied the ascendancy believed Earth had no option but compliance. She found herself wondering, almost idly, what it would feel like for something that's certain to discover it was wrong. At hour 36, two things happened almost simultaneously. First, the Security Council formally agreed to send a delegation to the fleet. A diplomatic transport was readied, and the decision was announced to the public. Second, and this was not announced at all, 600 kilometers above Earth's surface, inside an orbital facility most satellite trackers logged as a debris processing station, a set of enormous clamps released. A vessel began to move, slowly at first, then with gathering speed, away from its housing and out toward the dark. It did not look like other ships. Everyone who saw it up close later, everyone who was ever given the chance to study it, described the same first reaction, not quite awe, something more complicated than awe. It was the feeling of looking at an object built with total, uncompromising intent. Nothing about it was decorative. Every surface served a function. It was longer than it appeared at first glance, because scale was difficult to judge against open space, and its hull absorbed light rather than simply going unlit beneath it. The material had no name in any human language before the Bastion's engineers gave it one. They called it duskskin because touching it felt like putting your hand into the deepest part of the night. The Warden was 3.5 kilometers long. It massed more than a small asteroid. It was not the largest ship in the solar system by volume. What made it dangerous was not its size. What made it dangerous was everything the Bastion's people had recovered from that dead alien wreck. Everything they had spent 21 years learning to reproduce and then to improve, and everything the crew had trained years to use. Taken together, those things had produced something that had never existed before, not in human history, and, as it would eventually turn out, not quite anywhere else in the galaxy either. Captain Ria Solari stood on the Warden's bridge and watched Earth shrink behind them. She was 46, with steady hands and the unhurried bearing of someone who had already survived more than one impossible situation in an earlier career. She had been chosen for this command 3 years earlier, after a selection process that had eliminated more than 400 other candidates, and she had never been told the precise reasoning behind her selection. She had her guesses. "Navigation," she said. "Plot us an intercept course to the fleet, standard approach, do not hurry." "Yes, Captain," said her navigator, a young officer named Cayenne Ruiz, who did not ask why they weren't hurrying. He had learned in the short time he'd served under her that her instructions usually had more than one layer. Not hurrying in this case meant something specific. It meant, let them watch us come. Give them time to really look. Behind the warden, Earth turned slowly in the dark. 36 of the 96 hours were gone. The diplomatic transport was being readied in Geneva. The fleet waited beyond Neptune with the patience of something that had never once been proven wrong. The warden closed the distance, steady, unhurried, certain. Aboard the Ascendancy's fleet command vessel, a sensor technician named Ensign Taileyes Moore picked up the new contact at nearly the same moment the diplomatic signal arrived from Earth's surface. She stared at the two readings, confused for a moment, then flagged the unexpected one for her superior, Fleet Commander Corwin Dreth, a veteran of 7 prior integration operations, none of which had ever produced resistance more substantial than a formality. Dreth studied the sensor data. He studied the size of the new contact. He studied its heading. "It's moving toward us," Moore said, as though he might have missed that detail. He hadn't missed it. He was trying to decide what it meant. The vessel was large, larger than anything Earth's publicly documented military possessed. But Earth wasn't supposed to have anything like this. Every survey report the Ascendancy held on the species classified it as pre-contact, primitive, still reliant on combustion-based industry, barely capable of leaving its own gravity well in meaningful force. "Full scan," he said. "Every sensor we have." The scan came back. Moore read it twice, then looked up at her commander with an expression he had never once seen on her face. "Commander," she said carefully, "these readings should not be possible." Dreth took the data from her and read it himself. Then again. Then he set it down on the console very gently and stared at the approaching contact on the main display. The warden was still far away, still nothing more than a shape on a screen. But Dreth had enough experience in this business to know that distance in open space was a comfort that could vanish faster than anyone liked. And the data in front of him described something that had no business existing around a primitive world. Something that his experience, his certainty, and his 52 ships had not remotely prepared him for. He thought about the message they had sent. "We are patient. We are reasonable." He thought about the ship moving steadily toward him. He called for his senior staff. They gathered in the command chamber of the flagship, the Unbroken Vow. Dreth stood at the head of the table while his officers studied the same data, wearing, to a person, the same expression of controlled uncertainty. These were not officers who frightened easily. They had integrated 22 systems between them across their careers, but they were not fools either. "It's a warship," said Admiral Torvin Ash, the fleet's second-in-command, stating it plainly, the way one states an inconvenient fact that cannot be argued away. "Whatever we believed about this species' capabilities, that vessel is heavily armed, heavily shielded, and moving directly toward us." "Our survey data," began a younger officer. "Our survey data is wrong," Dreth said, cutting him off without malice. He had no patience left for defending bad intelligence. Bad intelligence was how operations went sideways. "That much is obvious. The question is what we do about it." Moore pulled the full scan onto the chamber's central display. The warden rotated slowly across the screen, every angle available for study. Silence held the room. "The hull composition doesn't match anything cataloged," Moore said quietly. "Not human manufacture, not any species in our archive. The drive's signature is consistent with," she paused, "with a Virling-class fold engine. But that technology was lost with the Virling collapse 350 years ago." The word landed hard. The Violin were not a comfortable subject in Ascendancy military circles. They had been the most advanced civilization the Ascendancy had ever encountered, and the only one that had ever genuinely frightened its founders. Their empire had collapsed under circumstances the Ascendancy's historians still described carefully, and its strategists still studied obsessively. "They found a Violin wreck," said Admiral Ash. "It wasn't quite a question." "It would be consistent with the readings," Moore said. Dreth exhaled slowly. He had led 7 integration operations. He had faced species that fought back, once even a fleet of 40 ships from a civilization considerably more advanced than Earth's known capability, and he had won every one of those engagements. But a Violin-derived drive was something else entirely. The Violin had built things the Ascendancy still did not fully understand, even after 3.5 centuries of study. If humans had spent 2 decades studying even a fragment of that technology, if they had been clever enough, desperate enough, focused enough. He thought briefly about what he actually knew of humans, stripped of the survey report's comfortable summary. A species whose history was, essentially, one long chain of conflict, fought over land, over belief, over resources, over ideas, a species whose technological development had never once outpaced its willingness to weaponize it. Creative in the specific, dangerous way that creatures became creative when survival had always depended on being the most dangerous thing in the room. He had not taken that seriously enough when he'd first read the survey. He was taking it seriously now. "Contact the diplomatic transport," he said. "Delay the scheduled meeting, tell them we require additional preparation time. And the Earth vessel." Sir, Ash asked. "Monitor it, do not target it, do not take any action that could be read as threatening." He looked at the screen, at the dark shape moving steadily through the dark toward them. "Not yet." Aboard the Warden, Captain Solari sat in her command chair and studied the fleet on the long-range display. She could see all 52 ships clearly now, and had spent the last several hours reading the subtle shifts in their formation, absorbing telemetry with a resolution no other vessel in Earth's inventory could have managed. The Ascendancy ships were well built, powerful, layered shielding, overlapping fields of fire, energy weapons that would open the hull of any conventional Earth warship in seconds. She was not in a conventional Earth warship. "They've adjusted formation," said her tactical officer, Lieutenant Priya Bhatt, who had a habit of speaking in short sentences when she was concentrating. 3 of the smaller ships moved outward, screening formation. They're being cautious. "Good," Solari said. Bhatt glanced at her. "Good. It means they saw us clearly enough to be cautious. That's the correct first impression." Solari leaned back slightly. "Status on the diplomatic transport." "Prepped and holding in Earth orbit, Captain." The fleet sent a message to Geneva requesting a delay. Cited preparation requirements. "Interesting." Solari turned that over. A delay request meant something had genuinely disrupted their schedule. The Warden was 4 hours out from the fleet. She intended to close to within 2 hours before stopping, close enough to be undeniable, far enough to avoid reading as aggression. There was a language to these things she'd found even with a species you'd never met, maybe especially with one. Officer Malik Fenn turned from the communications station. "Captain, incoming transmission directed at us specifically." "Put it up." The voice, run through translation software, arrived flat and careful, but even flattened it carried something, authority, the particular calm of something accustomed to being the most powerful presence in any exchange. "Unidentified Earth vessel. You are approaching a fleet of the Threshold Ascendancy on an intercept heading. Identify your purpose and halt your approach. Diplomatic contact is being handled through appropriate channels. There is no requirement for a military vessel to be present. Solari had Fen play it twice, not because she'd missed anything, but because she wanted to hear what was underneath it. She had spent a long career learning to listen that way. What she heard, underneath the careful authority, was a question they hadn't actually asked. "What are you?" She allowed herself the smallest smile. "Respond, text only, keep it short." She thought a moment, then dictated, "This vessel is the Warden. It is here because Earth sent it. We are not here to negotiate. We are here so that you understand what negotiating with Earth actually means." Bat studied her once the message went out. "That's going to make them nervous." "Yes," Solari agreed. "It is." "Is that the plan, making them nervous?" "Making them accurately informed is the plan," Solari said. "Nervousness is just what accurate information looks like when it contradicts everything you thought you knew." The response was read aloud in the Unbroken Vows command chamber and then read again. Dreth stood very still while he listened. "We are not here to negotiate. We are here so that you understand what negotiating with Earth actually means." There was no bluster in it. It was stated the way one states a fact the speaker believed completely and expected the listener to eventually come to understand. "They're bluffing," said Lieutenant Yorin Dask, a junior officer with an excellent record and a confidence Dreth was beginning to find grating. "One ship against 52, whatever their technology." "Pull up the weapon's signature again," Dreth said. Moore put it on screen. It was not what a bluffing vessel presented. Bluffers powered their weapons and raised their shields and made noise. The Warden moved quietly, weapons unpowered, shields reading at what the sensors interpreted as minimal output. It did not look like a ship preparing to fight. It looked like a ship that had never once needed to prepare. "It carries Violin-derived weapon architecture as well," Moore said. "I've been cross-referencing the archived data from the Violin campaign records. The energy profiles are different, modified, improved in places, but the base structure is consistent." "How many of our ships could it destroy?" Ash asked. The way a careful officer asks an unpleasant question directly without embarrassment, because embarrassment served no purpose in a command chamber. Moore was quiet a moment. "I don't have enough information to answer with confidence. A Violin vessel of equivalent size could, historically, engage a full fleet. These humans have held the technology for a much shorter time and may not have replicated it completely." She paused. "But if they have?" "Say it," Dreth said. "If they've fully replicated and improved upon Violin-class weapon systems, then one ship of this configuration could potentially engage our entire fleet, and we might not be able to stop it." The room went very quiet. Dreth looked at the screen at the Warden, still coming, still unhurried, still certain. He thought about his own message. "We are patient. We are reasonable." He thought about the reply. "We are not here to negotiate." He had been in this business long enough to know the difference between a species willing to die fighting and a species that did not expect to die at all. He had met the first kind many times. They were brave, and they were tragic, and they lost. He had never met the second kind. He hadn't believed the second kind existed among species as young as Earth. He was revising that belief rapidly. "Send a full report to the Assembly," he said quietly. "Request emergency authorization for alternative protocol." He looked at Ash. "And get me a direct communications channel to that ship. Voice, not text." "You want to speak to them yourself?" Ash asked, surprised. Commanders of Dreth's rank did not ordinarily conduct direct communication with the opposing party. That was what diplomats were for. "The diplomats," Dreth said, "aren't going to know what to say to this." He looked at the screen once more. "I might not either, but I intend to try." The request came through to the warden 40 minutes later. Solari took it on the bridge, full crew present, recorders running. The alien commander's voice, filtered through translation, was different from the first message, flatter, more deliberate, the sound of something working hard to stay even. Captain of the vessel Warden, I am Fleet Commander Corwin Dreth, commanding the integration fleet of the Threshold Ascendancy. I would like to understand the purpose of your approach. The purpose of our approach, Solari said, is to ensure that any conversation about Earth's future takes place in full awareness of what Earth is capable of. You sent a message assuming we were helpless. We're here to correct that assumption. A pause longer than translation lag should have required. You are one ship. Yes, Solari said, we are. Another pause. What is it you want from this encounter? Solari leaned forward slightly. We want what any species wants, to be left alone to make our own choices, to have this conversation between equals, not between a master and a subject. She let that settle. You brought 52 ships, Commander. We brought one. I'd like you to think carefully about what it means that we chose to send just the one. She cut the channel. Bat looked across the bridge. You cut him off. He needed time to think, Solari said. I gave him some. She turned back to the display. The fleet still sat beyond Neptune, still in formation, though 3 of the outer ships had shifted again, tighter now, pulling inward a defensive instinct, an unconscious closing of ranks. Solari watched it and felt something that wasn't quite confidence, something deeper. The particular feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what needed doing, with exactly the right tools in her hands. The warden moved on. The fleet waited. The silence between them was heavy with everything unsaid and everything about to change. The Threshold Assembly received Dreth's emergency report 14 hours after the warden began its approach. The Assembly convened in full session, unusual, and a signal in itself that the matter was being treated as significant enough to require collective authority. The chamber sat on a world 6 light-years from the solar system, its walls dark stone, its lighting low and steady. Unchanged in the 3 centuries the Assembly had used it to manage the Ascendancy's expansion, its integrations, its disputes. It had never received a report quite like this one. First Arbiter Ascendra Vale read it twice before speaking. She was old, even by the standards of her long-lived species, and carried the unhurried manner of someone who had stopped being surprised by most things decades ago. She was not unaffected by what she'd read. She was simply processing it with the tool a very long life had given her, the ability to remain calm while her understanding of a situation reversed itself completely. A Virelin-derived drive, she said, and weapon systems consistent with Virelin architecture, modified. Confirmed, said Advisor Bren Castell, the Assembly's chief military strategist, a sharp, deliberate officer. Our analysts have reviewed the sensor data 3 separate times. They're confident in the assessment. How does a primitive species acquire Virelin technology? The most probable explanation is a wreck, Castell said. The Virelin surveyed extensively before their collapse. They left vessels scattered across a wide volume of space. If one came down in the human solar system. How long ago? Unknown, long enough for them to study it and reproduce what we're seeing. Our estimate is a minimum of 15 years of dedicated, institutional-level reverse engineering, possibly longer. Vale considered a species her own survey teams had dismissed as generations away from being any kind of concern, quietly spending 15 years or more dismantling the most advanced technology the region had ever produced, learning how to make it work. She thought of Dreth's report. "We are not here to negotiate." "They knew we were coming," she said. "Or they suspected it," Castell said. "If the recovered technology included sensor capability far beyond their own development, they may have been watching a far larger volume of space than we assumed. They would have seen us approach. They had time to prepare." "And they built one ship," Vale said slowly. "One ship that they chose to send." "We don't know how many they have," Castell said carefully. The thought moved through the chamber like a current of cold air. Vale set the report down. "What are Commander Dreth's options?" Beside Castell, a quieter member of the Assembly, a logistics arbiter named Osen Prell, who rarely spoke in full cess. Ions, and was rarely wrong when he did, raised a hand slightly. "Arbiter, if I may, there is a third consideration beyond win, lose, or lose badly. If this species has held virulent technology for only 15 years and has already produced this, the more urgent question may not be what one ship can do to Commander Dreth's fleet. It may be what 10 years of further development does to the balance of this entire sector. We have built our strategic posture around the assumption that no rival power exists within 800 light years capable of contesting us directly. That assumption may already be obsolete. Whether Commander Dreth engages or withdraws changes very little about that underlying fact." Vale considered this longer than she had considered anything else in the session. "You're suggesting the outcome of this specific encounter may matter less than how we choose to respond to it strategically." "I'm suggesting both matter, Arbiter, but only one of them is still within our control by the time this session ends." "What are Commander Dreth's options?" she asked again, returning to Castell, though something in her tone had changed. "He's requested authorization for alternative protocol. In practical terms, he's asking whether to stand down or engage." "And if he engages?" Castell was quiet a moment. "That is the question I cannot answer with confidence, Arbiter. If the sensor data is fully accurate, if their weapons are what they appear to be, the outcome of direct engagement isn't predictable. We could win. We could lose. We could lose very badly." He paused. "There's also the matter of what Earth might hold in reserve if this is one ship among several." "Tell Commander Dreth to stand by," Vale said. "Continue monitoring, avoid provocation, maintain communication with the Earth vessel. I want more information before any decision is made." She looked around the chamber. "And I want to know everything we don't currently know about that ship, everything." The warden came to a stop 2 light towers from the fleet, far enough to read as non-threatening, close enough to be unmistakably present. The distance was deliberate. It was the kind of distance that said, "I am not attacking, but I am also not going anywhere." Captain Solari spent those hours doing 2 things. She ran her crew through drills, not because they needed the practice. They had trained on every engagement scenario the warden's systems could model, a very large number of scenarios for 3 straight years. And they knew the ship the way people know something they have spent years learning completely. But because drills gave people something to do, and people with something to do were less likely to be afraid. She had learned that a long time ago, in a different line of work, before the Bastion and the Warden and all of this. Busy hands kept minds steady. The thinking was harder. She turned the Ascendancy's position over in her mind. They had come expecting a species that would fold. They had found something else instead, and now their pride was tangled up with their uncertainty, a dangerous combination. Pride made powerful things do things their better judgment would otherwise forbid. She had watched that pattern in humans often enough across her career. She doubted it was unique to them. She needed the fleet to choose. Not the choice to fight, because even a warden victory would leave nothing worth calling a good outcome. Not the choice to simply withdraw either, because withdrawal only meant they returned later, better prepared, with a different plan. She needed a third choice, the one powerful parties avoided most, because it required real difficulty. She needed them to choose to talk, not from a position where they held every card. From a position where they genuinely didn't know who held the cards at all. To get there, she needed to show them something. Not everything, just enough. "Fen," she said, "open a channel to the fleet, all ships, not just the flagship." "Channel open, Captain." Solari spoke plainly, without theater. "This is Captain Solari of the Warden. I'm going to conduct a brief systems test. This is not an attack. Please observe." She glanced at Bat. "Fire the primary array. Target the debris field at bearing 190, Mark 12, single pulse, minimum yield." Bat didn't hesitate. She'd been waiting for the order. The Warden's primary weapon system had no real equivalent in the Ascendancy's arsenal. It produced no beam, no bolt, nothing conventional. The Violin had understood the nature of energy in ways human physics was still catching up to, and the weapon reflected that understanding. What left the Warden was a structured disruption in the fabric of space itself, aimed at a single precise point. What it did on arrival was separate its target from the energy holding it together, completely, instantaneously. The target, a chunk of rock and metal nearly 3 kilometers across, simply ceased to exist. No explosion, no fragmentation. A brief shimmer of released light where it had been, then nothing, clean, total, final. Solari gave the fleet 30 seconds to absorb it. "We have 4 more primary array emitters," she said. "We have secondary weapons that are, by comparison, conventional, but considerably beyond the range and yield of anything your fleet carries. Our shielding is derived from the same source as our weapons." She paused. "I want to be clear about something. The Warden is not here because Earth wants to fight you. We're here because Earth wants you to understand exactly what fighting us would cost. I believe you're beginning to calculate that cost right now." She closed the channel and looked at her crew. Bat was studying the weapons display with quiet professional satisfaction. Ruiz had gone very still at the navigation console. Fen looked like he'd been holding his breath the whole time. "Good work," Solari told them. "Now we wait." On the unbroken vow, the command chamber had gone completely silent. Every officer on the bridge had watched the debris field vanish. They had all seen impressive weapons fired before. None of them had watched a target simply cease to be. Moore ran the sensor data, fingers moving fast. "No radiation bloom consistent with explosive decompression," she said, half to herself. "No debris field, no residual energy signature beyond the initial release." She stopped. "It isn't a weapon, it's an annihilation system." Dreth said nothing for a long time. Annihilation systems were something the Violin had theorized. Their surviving archives, the fragments the Ascendancy had recovered after the collapse, mentioned such things the way scientists mentioned ideas that were technically possible but had never actually been built. Too much energy required, too much precision. Difficult, apparently, but not impossible. He thought about his fleet, 52 ships. He thought about what a weapon like that could do if the human captain decided to use it in earnest. The math wasn't complicated. It didn't require fear to arrive at. It required accuracy, and accuracy produced a very specific conclusion. He sat down. He had not sat down in his own command chamber in the middle of an operation in over a decade. The act of sitting was itself a kind of statement he wasn't sure he'd meant to make. But there it was. "Ash," he said, "get me the assembly emergency priority." He looked at the screen, at the warden sitting in its quiet, unmoving certainty. "And get me Captain Solari, direct line. Tell her I want to talk." Ash relayed the order, then looked at Dreth with the expression of a man reassessing a fundamental assumption. "You believe them," he said. "Not an accusation, an observation. You don't think this is a bluff." "I believed it before the demonstration," Dreth said. "That was for you." He looked at his second-in-command steadily. "And for me, if I'm honest." He glanced back at the screen. "We came here to integrate a primitive world. I want you to understand we did not fail. We simply encountered something our surveys failed to accurately assess. Those are very different things. One is a defeat. The other is new information." "New information," Ash agreed. "The question is what we do with it." Back on Earth, General Kessler watched the same feed through the warden's external sensors. The demonstration had been exactly what he'd authorized Solari to conduct if circumstances warranted it. He simply hadn't expected the circumstances to warrant it quite this fast. He'd hoped for more time. Time was always useful. It was also a luxury, and they were 36 hours into a 96-hour window, and the fleet still hadn't moved, and the diplomatic transport was still holding in Earth orbit, waiting on instructions Kessler had put on hold. He was in the room with 3 others, Miriam Solano, who hadn't spoken in almost 2 hours, Commander Ockhaffer running his own private calculations off the demonstration footage, and the Secretary General present on a small, secure feed from New York, her expression carefully composed in the particular way leaders' faces get composed when everything is still balanced on an edge. "They'll ask for a formal meeting now," Kessler said. "Dreth is a careful officer. That report tells me he isn't a fool. He'll do what careful officers do when they hit something they didn't plan for, gather information, and we'll talk to him." "We will talk to him," the Secretary General repeated. It wasn't quite a question. "On our terms," Kessler confirmed. "That's what the warden is for." He paused. "Not to fight, to make sure that when we do talk, they're actually listening." Solano spoke for the first time in hours, her voice thoughtful, the voice of someone who had spent the silence making careful observations. "They'll want to know if there are more ships," she said. "That will be their first real question." "What do we tell them?" the Secretary General asked. "Ked." Silence held the room. Kessler and Solano looked at each other. The honest answer was complicated because the honest answer was that there was only one warden, that it had taken every resource the Bastion possessed to build it, and that if the fleet called the bluff, there were real limits to what even the warden could accomplish alone. But the fleet didn't know that. "We tell them the truth," Solano said finally, "carefully." Kessler raised an eyebrow. "And what's the truth, carefully?" She thought a moment. "That Earth always has more in reserve than people expect. That's been true of humanity for its entire history, and it happens to be true right now." She paused. "The question isn't how many ships we actually have, General. The question is what the Ascendancy is willing to risk to find out." The direct line between Dreth and Solari opened 6 hours after the demonstration. Both had spent the intervening time doing essentially the same thing, thinking very carefully about every word they were about to say. Aboard the Warden, Solari had briefed her senior officers, walked the ship's long corridors twice in the slow, deliberate way she did when she needed to organize her thoughts, then sat alone in her cabin with a cup of tea that went cold while she assembled exactly what she wanted to say and how. Aboard the Unbroken Vow, Dreth had done something similar, minus the tea. He had also received a short, largely unhelpful message from the Assembly instructing him to proceed with caution, without specifying what caution looked like this far outside the ordinary operational playbook. The communication was voice only, run through translation on both ends. Both of them understood they were being recorded, and that the recording would matter long after the conversation ended. Dreth spoke first. "Captain Solari, I appreciate your willingness to speak directly. I don't find indirect communication especially useful at this stage," Solari said. "I'd rather speak plainly. I suspect you'd prefer that too." A pause, "You're correct. Then I'll be plain." "Your demonstration was effective," Dreth said. "I understand what you were showing us. I want you to know I am not by nature an unreasonable officer. I did not come to your system because I take pleasure in conquest. I came because I was ordered to, and because my assembly regards Earth's integration as inevitable and in the interest of every party involved." "Including Earth," Solari said. "Including Earth, the ascendancy offers stability, protection, access to resources and technology your species would take generations to develop on your own." "In exchange for what?" "Submission to ascendancy law, tribute, limited sovereignty over internal matters." Solari was quiet a moment. "Commander, I want to ask you something honestly, and I'd like you to actually think about the answer before you give it. If another fleet had appeared outside your homeworld when your species was young, and offered you exactly what you just offered us, backed by 52 warships, would you have accepted it?" Dreth was quiet for a long time. When he answered, his voice was more careful than before. "Our history isn't identical to yours." "That's not an answer." Another long pause. "No," he said finally, "we would not have accepted it." "Good," Solari said, "because I don't believe the ascendancy would respect a species that did. I need you to understand something about humans, Commander. We are not brave because we're strong. We are more often brave precisely when we're weak. We've been proving that to each other for the whole of our history. You arrived with 52 ships and told us we had no choice. That didn't frighten us. It focused us." Dreth took a long moment with that. "The ship," he said. "How long have you been building it?" 21 years, Solari said. She saw no reason to lie about it. "From the day we recovered the technology that made it possible to the day we launched." 21 years, he repeated it slowly. "You found a violin wreck." "We found something," Solari said. "True, and enough to confirm what he already suspected without confirming anything he didn't. Are there more ships like this one, Commander? That's the question you need to think very carefully about before deciding your next move." There was a brief silence on his end that the translation software rendered as nothing, but that she suspected had been something closer to reluctant appreciation. She pressed on before the moment passed. "Here is what I want you to understand. Earth is not asking to join the ascendancy. Earth is not asking to be left entirely alone either. What Earth is asking for is a conversation between parties who are honest about what each of them can actually do. You can do a great deal. You have technology, resources, and connections across systems we don't yet understand. Those are real advantages." She paused. "But Earth is not what your surveys told you it was, and now you know that. So the real question is what the threshold ascendancy does when it encounters something that doesn't fit its model." "You're asking us to treat you as equals," Dreth said. "I'm asking you to treat us as what we actually are," Solari said. "Which is a species that built that." She gestured, though he couldn't see it, toward the empty space where the debris field used to be, in 21 years from nothing with no outside help. What we'll be capable of in 50 years or 100, I can't predict. I imagine you're already thinking about it." The silence that followed was the longest yet. When Dreth spoke again, something in his voice had shifted, not weakness, not defeat, something closer to a door opening after a very long time shut. "I need to consult with my assembly," he said. "Of course," Solari said. "We'll be here." Miriam Solana was on a transport from Geneva to a secure facility in the Yukon, where General Kessler would brief her in person, when word came through that Dreth had formally requested a suspension of the integration timeline pending consultation with the Assembly. She read the report twice, the cabin humming quietly around her, cloud cover sliding past below. The suspension wasn't a victory. She knew this business too well to mistake a pause for a decision. The Ascendancy could pause, consult, decide it was willing to absorb the losses of engaging the Warden and return with more force later. A pause was a moment of uncertainty, and uncertainty was useful, but it was not the same thing as an outcome. What it was, she thought, was an opening, and openings were what diplomats were for. When she arrived, Kessler was waiting, looking like a man who'd been awake for 30-some hours making consequential decisions, with coffee that was probably also cold. He handed her a set of files without preamble. "Solari gave them everything we authorized and nothing we didn't," he said. "She's good." "I know," Solano said. "I listened to the whole exchange on the transport." She opened the first file. "They'll come back with conditions. An organization like the Ascendancy doesn't simply walk away from a system it's already targeted. It recalibrates." "What do they want?" "What they've always wanted: stability, predictability, control of the variables inside their territory. What they don't want," she said, flipping through the pages, "is a war they can't be certain of winning against a species that just demonstrated it can build things their best military science says shouldn't exist. They'll want guarantees, limits. They'll want to understand exactly what they're dealing with." "And we give them what?" "Honesty," Solano said. "Carefully selected honesty. We tell them our development of advanced technology is ongoing and will continue. We tell them we have no interest in expansion or aggression. We tell them we're very interested in the kind of stable relationship with the wider galaxy that doesn't require anyone to be subordinate to anyone else." She paused. "And we invite them to discuss what that relationship might actually look like." "They might say no." "They might," she agreed. "But not right now. Right now they're sitting outside our solar system looking at a ship that made a debris field disappear and wondering what else we're holding back. That isn't a state of mind that produces a confident no." She looked back up at him. "I need to be on a ship to the fleet within 6 hours. I need the delegation assembled. I need full authorization to offer terms, and I need to know exactly which terms I can offer and which I can't." "That's a great deal for 6 hours." "Then we should stop talking and start working," Solano said. She was on a transport within 5.5 hours, not 6. A fact she would mention to no one and take a private, stubborn pride in for years afterward. The delegation she assembled in that window was small by design. Herself, 2 senior legal officers versed in treaty law that had never once been applied to a non-human counterparty, and a linguist named Farouk ibn Rashid who had spent the last 4 days doing nothing but absorb every scrap of translated ascendancy communication the fleet had produced, building sentence by sentence, a working theory of how the species actually thought rather than merely how its language technically parsed. It was Rashid who warned her, an hour before the transport docked with the unbroken vow, that the Ascendancy's formal greeting protocol likely carried more weight than its content suggested, and that getting it slightly wrong would cost her nothing tactically, but might cost her something she would not be able to name or recover for the rest of the negotiation. She listened. She had the protocol read to her 4 times before she stepped off the transport. The Assembly's response reached Dreth 18 hours after his emergency report. Asandra Vale had called a full session, unusual, and a signal in itself that the matter was being treated with the full weight of collective authority. Dreth had expected either an order to engage or an order to stand down completely. The Ascendancy was not an organization that typically offered a middle path. What came back instead was something he had never once encountered across his entire career: a conditional authorization. The Assembly authorized him to enter formal diplomatic contact with Earth, not integration negotiations. Diplomatic contact. The distinction carried real weight. Integration negotiations assumed one party was entering the Ascendancy's fold. Diplomatic contact assumed two parties with an undefined relationship, exploring possibilities. It was the language the Ascendancy reserved for other powerful, independent states, of which there were very few. The Assembly also authorized him to share, selectively, certain information about the wider galaxy with Earth's representatives. Not everything, but enough to demonstrate good faith, enough to signal that the Ascendancy recognized precisely what it was facing. There was a note appended at the end, added personally by Vale rather than the Assembly as a body. It read simply, "Learn everything you can about their other ships." Dreth read the message, then told Moore to contact the Warden. "Tell them we're prepared to receive a diplomatic delegation. Civilian, not military, if one is available." Within the hour, a reply came back, relayed through the Warden. A diplomatic transport was already being prepared. It would arrive in approximately 14 hours, led by a representative named Miriam Solano. Dreth spent those 14 hours preparing his own delegation and reviewing everything he knew of human psychology, which turned out to be considerably less than he would have liked. He also spent time reviewing the Warden's sensor profile, sitting motionless 2 light towers away with the patient quality of something that had no particular reason to hurry. He found himself returning again and again to Solari's question. If another fleet had appeared outside your homeworld when your species was young and offered you exactly what you just offered us, would you have accepted it? He thought of his own species' early contact with the Ascendancy, gentler than what he had brought to Earth, but still a set of terms his ancestors had not chosen freely. He thought about what that had felt like in the old histories, in the stories his grandparents' generation still told. The complicated pride, the complicated loss, the long, slow process of finding a place inside something vast that had never been built with them in mind. Earth had seen that future coming. They had had time to prepare, and they had prepared in the most human way imaginable, by building something no one expected and pointing it directly at the problem. He could not quite decide whether he admired that or whether it frightened him. He suspected, honestly, that it was both. The diplomatic transport appeared on long-range sensors at hour 50. It was small, unarmed, moving unhurried, the Warden barely visible far behind it, still and watchful, a guardian content to wait as long as necessary. Dreth straightened his uniform, took a breath, and prepared himself to do something no prior integration had ever required of him: negotiate as an equal. Miriam Solano had sat in many rooms in her career designed to be impressive, rooms with high ceilings and important furniture, rooms where the silence carried the weight of decisions, rooms whose every surface announced the power of the people who occupied them. She had long since learned not to be moved by rooms. Rooms were rooms. What mattered was who sat in them and what they were willing to say. The meeting chamber aboard the Unbroken Vow was not what she'd expected. She had braced for something militaristic and angular, designed to project dominance. Instead, it was almost spare, long, curved walls of dark material that absorbed light without feeling oppressive. A genuinely functional table without ornament. Chairs arranged with no obvious hierarchy, which she suspected was either a very deliberate diplomatic signal or simply how the Ascendancy's military actually conducted its business. Commander Dreth met her personally at the chamber's entrance, without ceremony. He was taller than she'd expected from the voice on the recordings, and he wore the look of someone who had spent the last several hours making peace with a decision he wasn't entirely comfortable with. She recognized that look. She'd worn it herself often enough. They exchanged the formal greeting the translation team had spent 14 hours preparing. Then Dreth looked at her directly and said, in a tone clearly off his prepared remarks, "Your ship is still out there." "Yes," Solano said, "it is. I assume it will remain there for the duration of our discussions." "That's correct." He nodded slowly. "I want to tell you something before we sit down. And it isn't in my prepared remarks. I'm saying it because I believe honesty serves both of us better than the alternative." He paused. "I have led 7 integration operations. All of them succeeded. None of them ever required me to enter a room without knowing which side held the advantage." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know I understand what your ship is for, and I want you to know that I am—" He stopped, searching for the word. Impressed is not strong enough. "What your species built, in the time you had, with the resources you had, is not something I would have believed possible without the evidence in front of me." Solano let the statement sit a moment before answering. "Commander, humans have a saying, necessity is the mother of invention. It means that when we have to do something, we find a way." She glanced, briefly, toward the direction where the warden waited, invisible beyond the hull but present in every calculation being made in that room. "You gave us a very clear necessity." Something in Dreth's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but close. "Then let us hope," he said, "that necessity produces something useful from this meeting as well." They sat down. The negotiations lasted 4 days. They were not comfortable days. There were moments when Solano genuinely believed the whole process would collapse, when the Ascendancy's representatives insisted on language no Earth government could accept, when Earth's position on sovereignty produced a full hour of silence that felt like it was about to tip into something worse, when a junior Ascendancy officer said something the translation software rendered technically accurate and deeply offensive, requiring nearly half an hour of careful repair to move past. But the talks did not collapse, in part because both sides understood exactly what stood behind them. The Ascendancy could not pretend it had no knowledge of the warden. Earth could not pretend it hadn't heard the original ultimatum and understood precisely what it implied about the Ascendancy's intentions. There was no comfortable fiction available to either side. No polite agreement to pretend power was evenly distributed, or that either party's intentions were purely good. What there was instead was a shared understanding that the current situation was genuinely uncertain for both of them, and that uncertainty was a far better place to negotiate from than a false certainty that would collapse the moment anyone tested it. Solano had spent her career navigating exactly this kind of dynamic between human governments, human factions, human interest groups. This was structurally the same kind of situation, 2 parties with different interests, different histories, different capabilities, searching for a stable arrangement neither could achieve through simple domination. The scale was different. The specific details were unrecognizable. The underlying human element, her understanding of how negotiation actually worked from the inside, was exactly the same. She used it carefully. On the 3rd day, Dreth asked her, in a private session, the question she'd been expecting from the very beginning. How many ships like the Warden does Earth have? Solano looked at him across the small table they used for private sessions. She had prepared several answers to this question. She gave him the one she'd settled on, which was also the true one. Commander, the Warden took 21 years and more resources than any other project in Earth's history. It took everything we had, every scientific insight we'd managed to develop, every engineer and physicist who had spent years learning to understand what we'd found. She met his eyes. So the honest answer today is one. Right now we have one. He watched her carefully, and tomorrow... Tomorrow is a different question, she said. We know more now than we did 21 years ago. We've built the first one. The second will be faster, the third faster still. She paused. I'm telling you this because I think honesty serves us better than the alternative. You would find out eventually. I would rather you found out from me in this room where we can discuss what it means than from your censors in 5 years when it becomes a crisis. Dreth was quiet for a long time. You understand what you're describing, he said finally. In 50 years, in 100. Yes, Solano said. We do. Humans have been thinking about this since long before we ever left our own planet. We understand how power reshapes relationships. We understand what a species looks like when it builds capacity. She folded her hands on the table. We are not interested in what the Ascendancy has spent 3 centuries building. We're interested in our own system, our own people, our own future. But we're also interested in not being alone in a galaxy that turns out to be full of other species with their own interests. A relationship that gives us security and gives the ask. And Dancy stability, without requiring either of us to give up what we are. That seems like something worth working toward. What you're describing, Dreth said slowly, isn't integration, it's a treaty between equals. Yes, Solano said, it is. He considered that for a long time, then he said something she hadn't expected. My own species didn't have that option, he said. When we were young and we were found, we weren't ready. We didn't have what you have. We had to accept terms that weren't equal. He paused. I've sometimes wondered what we might have become if we'd come to the Ascendancy on our own terms. Solano thought about that. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it simply, without elaboration. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read through the unfamiliar features. Then he said, let us write a treaty. The Solar Boundary Accord, as it came to be known, was signed on the 7th day. It ran 11 pages, short for a document of its consequence. It established Earth's sovereign territory, defined the terms under which Earth and the Threshold Ascendancy would interact, created a joint communication framework, and in a clause the Assembly had debated across 3 of the 4 negotiating days, acknowledged Earth's right to develop its own military capability without Ascendancy oversight, in exchange for a commitment that Earth would not initiate aggressive action against any Ascendancy member world. The Ascendancy had never before signed such an agreement with a species it had originally targeted for integration. It would not be the last time it did so, but it was the first, and first things carried a weight that later things never quite replicated. Ascendra Vale signed for the Assembly remotely, her authorization transmitted across 6 light years. Solano signed for Earth, backed by the recorded consent of every government on the planet, consent that 4 days of negotiation had made possible, and that Earth's governments, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, had found themselves genuinely unified in giving. When the signing was finished, Dreth stood and looked at Solano across the table. One more question, he said, not official, personal. Go ahead. The ship, Captain Solari, she knew exactly how we'd react when she fired that demonstration. She understood the psychology of it precisely, How confident was she that it would work? Solano thought about that, about Ria Solari, whom she'd met briefly before the diplomatic transport launched, who had looked at her with those steady eyes and said simply, "Do good work." "I believe," Solano said finally, "that she was confident it was the right thing to do. Whether it would work was a separate question, and I think she understood there was a difference. She was prepared for it to fail. She was prepared for any outcome," Solano said. "That's what made her the right person to send." Captain Solari received word of the signed accord 7 hours after the ceremony. She was on the bridge, reading an engineering report when Fenn brought her the transmission. She read it, set it down, and said nothing for a moment. Then she looked out through the warden's forward sensors at the fleet, which had begun slowly to redeploy, not retreating exactly, repositioning. The formation that had held beyond Neptune for nearly 2 weeks was dissolving into something looser, the ships spreading out, the sharp readiness of their original posture softening into something closer to neutral. "They're moving," Bat said from tactical. "I see it." "Not toward us." Bat sounded faintly surprised, as though some part of her had still been braced for a last-minute reversal. "No," Solari said, "not toward us." She thought about the 21 years that had produced this ship. The teams at the Bastion, the engineers who had spent their careers reverse engineering an alien technology through trial and sometimes spectacular error. The scientists who had argued over equations in underground rooms for years at a stretch. The workers who had built and rebuilt and tested and rebuilt again. She thought about the people who had kept the secret, not for their own sake, but because they understood exactly what the secret was for. Not a weapon for conquest, not a tool for revenge, an argument, the most expensive and complicated argument humanity had ever made, delivered in the most direct language available. We are here. We are capable. We are not what you assumed. She thought about what would come next. More ships eventually, more contact with the wider galaxy. More species, more politics, more negotiations that would demand people fluent in both the technical language of power and the human language of trust. Earth's future was not going to be an easy one. Easy futures belonged to species that stayed home and never looked up. Humans had been looking up since they first sat around fires on a single continent, and they had never quite managed to stop. She was glad of that. Glad of all of it, the looking up, the reaching out, the stubborn refusal to accept that any ceiling was really the ceiling. Glad of this ship and the people aboard it and the 21 years of focused human stubbornness that had made it possible. Back at the Bastion, buried under its 2 kilometers of Yukon rock, General Kessler received the same transmission Solari had, at almost the same moment, and read it standing in the long observation gallery where the warden's keel had first been laid down 2 decades earlier. 7,000 people had passed through that mountain across 21 years, most of them never once seeing daylight during their longest working stretches. All of them bound by agreements that asked them to build something they might never be allowed to publicly acknowledge, in service of a threat that, for 19 of those 21 years, had been entirely theoretical. He thought, standing there, of all the ordinary arguments that had nearly ended the program at various points of budget committees that had come within a single vote of canceling it in its 9th year. A change of government in its 14th that had briefly threatened to declassify and dismantle the entire effort. A catastrophic containment failure in year 16 that had killed 4 engineers and nearly convinced the oversight board the whole approach was unworkable. The program had survived all of it by the same method it had survived everything else. A small number of people deciding, quietly and repeatedly, that some problems were worth solving even if you might not live to see whether the solution worked. He allowed himself, for the first time in over a decade, to stand in that gallery without an active crisis pulling at his attention, and found that he did not entirely know what to do with the stillness. Commander Ockhaffer, watching the fleet's redeployment from the same bunker where he'd first seen the sensor data, found himself thinking less about the ascendancy and more about the 800 light-years of Galaxy Advisor Castel's colleague had apparently gestured toward in some intercepted internal assembly communication Earth's own signals analysts were still working to fully translate. 800 light-years of a galaxy Earth had, until 2 weeks ago, assumed it was essentially alone in. He began drafting, that same afternoon, the first outline of a proposal that would eventually become the Deep Watch program, Earth's first standing effort to actually look outward with the assumption that something worth seeing was already looking back. It would take 3 more years to fund and 11 more to produce results. He would not be the one to see most of those results. He started the outline anyway. Navigation, she said. Set a course for home, standard speed. Standard speed, Captain, Ruiz said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard from him before, a kind of lightness, as if a weight he'd gotten so used to carrying he'd stopped noticing it had finally come off. The warden turned. Earth hung ahead on the sensor display, a small light, blue and white, tiny against the enormous dark. The Threshold Ascendancy's fleet fell behind them, repositioning, reconsidering, beginning the long process of adjusting to a galaxy that now held one more thing than it had previously accounted for. In the warden's corridors, the crew moved through their routines. Some talked quietly, some didn't. Some had already begun the quiet, unconscious work of turning the last 2 weeks from something happening into something that had happened, a story they would each carry for the rest of their lives and tell differently depending on who was listening and what that person was ready to hear. Talia Reyes was not aboard the warden. She was back at her console at the relay station, eating a new sandwich, actually eating it this time. The solar system was quiet that day. The deep space relays recorded nothing but ordinary background noise. Whatever else moved through the wider galaxy was going about its business without announcing itself, for now. She understood that would not always be true. She understood that what had happened over the last 2 weeks had opened something, a door that did not close simply because someone wished it would. Earth was part of the galaxy now in a way it had never quite been before, whether it had agreed to that or not. Other species would hear about the Accord. Other species would hear about the warden. They would run their own calculations, draw their own conclusions, decide what it all meant for their own plans. Some would be frightened. Some would be curious. Some would look at Earth exactly the way the Threshold Ascendancy first had, as a target, a resource, a problem to be managed. They would all eventually make the same discovery the Ascendancy had made. They would all, in their own time and their own way, arrive at the same answer. Huma. Nidhi had been here all along, preparing, watching, learning, building quietly and seriously, and with the absolute focus humans reserved for moments when they understood completely what was at stake. And when the moment finally came, it had not sent a plea. It had not raised a white flag. It had not begged or bargained or bowed. It had sent the warden. And for now, the warden was enough. It was enough. And humans, being humans, were already thinking about what came after enough, already sketching new designs on data slates, already running new equations in underground rooms, already asking the next question, the one that always followed the question that had just been answered. Because that was what humans did. That was what they had always done. In the end, it was the most dangerous thing about them, not the ships they built, but the certainty that whatever they had just built, they were already imagining something better. The warden moved through the dark between the stars, heading home. Around it, the galaxy turned in its old, patient rhythms, vast, indifferent, and full of things that had not yet decided what they thought about Earth. They would have time to decide,